And so Paul's answer to the national Jewish rejection of the Messiah is to say that God's never been in the business of saving people nationally. But even as far back as the time of Jacob and Esau, he was picking people before they were even born, those whom he would save. And just for your information, and we all know this, Jacob and Esau are the grandchildren of Abraham. Jacob's name is changed later to Israel. So if we're talking about Israel's salvation or rejection as a whole, he's taking it right back to the beginning, right back to Jacob, and saying Jacob was chosen before birth and not even his twin brother. So this is strictly a decision based on the planned knowledge and purpose of God. Flip forward to Romans 10:9. We'll see Paul writes what has become a very familiar verse to us all, that if you confess with your mouth Jesus as Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. So there's a problem again, because the objection was, for the most part, that the Jews were not believing in Jesus Christ and being saved. In fact, they were crucifying him. So what do we do with this? If Israel is largely rejecting Jesus Christ, had God's plan failed, is the question. Did God set out with the best of intentions with Abraham and it just fell apart? Was God hoping for something with these people that never came to fruition? And if God's plan failed, what is he going to do now? What's he going to do with these people? Is he going to reject them? Is that the next move? And that's where we come back into Romans 11:1. God has not rejected his people, has he? And this is where we're getting into what we studied the last time I was here. Paul answered with may it never be. That sounds like a pretty soft rebuke in our modern English language, may it never be. In his language, that was the strongest way of saying, absolutely not. Paul said, are you actually considering the fact that God has rejected the Jews? I'm a Jew. I'm a descendant of Abraham. I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. And that proves beyond a shadow of a fact that God has not rejected the Jews. And then Paul continued in verse 2, we saw last time, saying that God did not reject the people whom he foreknew. And we spent some time last time going through the New Testament and building a case of what it meant for God to foreknow anything. That means that before the foundation of the world, God knew exactly who he would save. And it was his plan to save people from every tongue and tribe and people and nation. And the remnant of Jews was saved in this fashion. So that was introduction. I know I skipped over a lot of verses. There's a lot more verses I could have said. There's probably some in there I could have taken away. But I wanted to get us all mentally on the same page as where Paul's at right now, so that we're into the text together. Tonight we're going to look at 3 points. Number 1, God's purposes have not failed because there has always been a remnant. Number 2, God's purposes have not failed because the remnant is chosen by God. And number 3, God's purposes have not failed because the remnant is saved by his grace. So we are going to look at point number 1 now. God's purposes have not failed because there has always been a remnant. So let's read together again 2b, so the second half of verse 2 through 4. Or do you not know what the Scripture says in the passage about Elijah? How he pleads with God against Israel. Lord, they have killed your prophets. They have torn down your altars, and I alone am left. And they're seeking my life. But what is the divine response to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So Paul quotes 2 verses from 1 Kings chapter 19. And he challenges the readers if they knew what the Scripture says in the passage about Elijah. And I think that's a fair thing to ask somebody. If you've been in the faith, if you've been in this Word most of your life, it's a fair thing to just say, don't you know what the Scripture says in the passage about Elijah? And they should know it. And we should know it too, if we're going to understand what Paul's trying to prove here. So I think it's beneficial for us if we just pause for a minute and go back and see in detail what he's talking about in 1 Kings 19. You don't have to flip there. I'm just going to talk about it. Basically, in this passage from 1 Kings chapter 19, we have Queen Jezebel, who's married to King Ahab. And Elijah, see, I walk away because I think I'm going to walk away and then I'm like, I'm so afraid. Where's my notes? Should have been more prepared. The prophet of God, Elijah, had spoken to King Ahab in chapter 18. And he's asked him to call together all the people. Let me start over again. I'm sorry. Jezebel had led all of the people into evil Baal worship, is what had happened. The Jews are worshiping Baal even. Now Elijah has it in his mind that he is the last standing prophet of God. So he goes to King Ahab and he says, gather all the people together at Mount Carmel and we're going to have a contest, basically. So they gather all the people together and he says, this is what we're going to do. Prophets of Baal, you set up an altar for Baal. I'll set up an altar for God. And then take a bull, cut it up into pieces. You put a bull on your altar. I'll put a bull on God's altar. Put wood under the bull. Nobody lights your fire. And now he says, call upon your God. I'll call upon my God. Whichever God starts the fire, he's the real God. So they spend the morning calling upon the God of Baal. And of course, nothing happens. So Elijah starts mocking them. Call louder. Maybe he's on vacation. Maybe he's asleep. Maybe he's busy. Maybe he can't hear you. And nothing happens. So when it becomes Elijah's turn, he comes over to his altar and he digs a trench. Well, first of all, he places 12 stones around his altar, and one stone for each tribe of Judah. And then he digs a trench all around his altar. And he asks them to fill, all the prophets of Baal, he says, fill buckets of water and pour them into the trench. And then when they did all that, he said, fill them again. And they poured them in. And he said, fill them a third time. And they poured the water in there again. And then Elijah called on God. And God sent such a fire down from heaven, it not only consumed all of the bull, it consumed all of the stones around it, it sucked up all the water, there was nothing left. Now this did more than convince everybody that God was the only God. So what did Elijah do? Elijah said, let's get him. And he killed every prophet of Baal. Now this didn't exactly make Jezebel happy. So Jezebel sends a death threat to Elijah for what he had done. She said, for what you have just done, by this time tomorrow, you're a dead man. So Elijah, who is typically a pretty strong guy, he's feeling the heat now of this death threat coming on to him. And so we see him saying, Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have torn down your altars, I alone am left, and they're seeking my life. But what is the divine response to him? He says in verse 4 of our text tonight, God's response is, I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So this is what God's saying to Elijah. You thought you were the only one left? Did you really think you were the only one with the wisdom to cling to me? And God says, I have kept for myself. Now notice, this is showing the power of God in the transformed life. Notice the text does not say, the remnant has kept themselves for him. Right? That's not what the text says. That's what we'd like it to say. But that's not what it says. It shows that God is powerfully keeping them for himself.